Trebizond is a filament silk, which is most commonly used on 18 mesh needlepoint canvas. But if you are willing to take it apart, you can actually use it for fine embroidery. What you want to do is open the cap, do this carefully with your thumbnail, unwrap some of the thread, and before you actually cut it, wrap a little of it back onto the spool. Filament silk's really wiry, and this will help keep it somewhat tamed. Once you've cut the thread, tap the ends and you'll see the tiny filaments that make up the thread. They're actually twisted together, and you'll find 3 bundles in the thread if you twist it slightly apart. You'll need to back twist this. If you twist it forward, it will get tighter. If you twist it backwards, it will get looser, and you'll be able to see the little tiny sections as pictured. Stick your needle in between the sections and pull them apart, and then you'll end up with 3 distinct bundles. Each of these bundles has a bunch of little filaments inside it. Next, take one of the bundles and pull it out. If you pull it out, it will be a little bit wiry, so it's going to kind of bunch back up on itself, but it'll be okay, just flatten it back out. Do this with all 3 of the bundles, and then just lay them on the table so that you know that you've gotten them separated. Once you're done with that, take the 2 that you're not going to use for the moment, wrap them back around the spool, and lock them back into the cap. This will keep them safe while you're working on the rest of the thread. If you want to use the bundle intact, you can use it on 36 to 40 count linen. These are 37 count legacy linens in satin stitch for the Bargello pattern. You can also use it for stem stitch, cross stitch over 2, but again, it makes really fabulous satin stitches. Now this is where the fun begins. To take a single bundle apart, you're going to back twist it again, and you're going to try to find the smaller groupings. Unlike the 3 main bundles, these filaments aren't really bundled together, so it's definitely more of a challenge. But it's worth it in the end if you want to be able to have more color options on fine count linens. After you've back twisted it, look for some natural separations between some of the filaments. They're not going to be exactly evenly spaced because, again, they're not really twisted together. They're just kind of loosely grouped, in part by static electricity. When you can find where the separations are, put your needle in between, separate it a little bit further, and then pull out one of the sections from the bundle. Be careful as you do this, only because you don't want to try to grab too much at the same time. Otherwise, it will definitely cause a problem. As I said, they're not going to be exactly even. Treat this as a feature, not a bug. Continue separating the little groupings as much as possible. You don't want to get down to too fine, because if you do, that's a lot harder to work with. You will discover, as you work with this, that there's a likelihood that you'll end up with a tangle. I just smooth it out with my hand. It will actually, most of the time, untangle itself naturally. Do not try to pull them apart, just try to smooth it out as much as possible. You will occasionally have to pull out one of the tiny filaments just to get rid of it because it's not going to want to stay with its friends. But that's okay. There's a lot of filaments in this, and so there's a lot of play in it. Just continue separating them. You can use a combination of fingers, fingernails, and needles to make this work, and try to pull apart any tangles that you run into. As you see in the little photo, there are a lot of little tiny filaments in there. The more you work with this, the more static electricity is going to get produced, and the more stuff's going to get fly away. You can tell just from my working method, if I dropped it in the middle of the air, it would not drop straight down. It would just kind of float around for a bit. You do want to just take a little bit more care with it, be a little slower with it, but know that it's going to get a bit more wiry as you work with it. You can tell there's one single strand I have left here. This is finer than a human hair. That's what one of the single filaments look like. I have actually stitched with a single filament on a really fine linen, but it's really hard to work with, so I've opted to keep it in the bundles that they kind of naturally want to come into. Just smoothing out as much as possible, and occasionally taking out one of the single filaments that does not want to stay in the bundle. Once you've gotten the Trebizond stripped down to a bunch of small little groupings of filaments, you can use this to stitch on very fine count linen. My test sample here is a 53-59 count linen, and the stitches are cross stitch over 2, cross stitch over 1, and satin stitch. You can do it on 50/55s, you can do it on 46s. You might want to use a couple of the bundles on something like 46 count, but this gives you a lot more color options on very fine count linens. To help set the pH in your hands, which will make the silk easier to handle, mix 1 part white vinegar to 2 parts water. I'm just putting this in a tiny pitcher that I have because it'll make it easier to pour it in the misting bottle I plan to use. You can, in fact, rinse your hands in this, but I like putting it into a tiny spray bottle because then I can keep this in my needlework supplies. I can take it with me wherever I go, and I don't have to worry about being near a solution or a sink. I'm going to be putting my threads on a thread card that I've made up, and it means I'm going to be touching the threads and stroking them quite a bit, which is going to generate more static electricity. To help with separating the threads and so that my pH in my hands is closer to what the silk wants, I'm going to spray my fingertips on both sides of my hand with the spray solution that I mixed up earlier, 1 part white vinegar to 2 parts of water. I like doing the spray mixture just because it makes it much easier to carry with me. So now that I've reset the pH in my fingers, I can put my threads on my thread card. You can do this at any point. You're obviously going to need to do this while you're stitching on a regular basis. Just make sure your hands are dry. And now that I can pick up the threads, you can see they don't quite stick to my hand quite as much. Now, to put them on the thread card, fold your thread in half so that you have a loop. Push the loop through the hole, and then put your fingers through the loop and grab the other part of the thread, pulling it through the loop, and then snug it up against the cardstock. I do this for a lot of my threads, regardless of how flyaway they tend to be, because I like thread cards as a great way to store things. Do this with however many threads you've made up. You can punch holes on both sides. You can punch holes in a circle. You can do them however you want. Now that I've gotten all of my threads onto my thread card, I need a way to store it. I generally put them in just a plain envelope. You do not want to use plastic with silks like this because they will stick to the inside of the plastic. It generates quite a bit of static electricity, and you'll find it hard to deal with the threads if you stored them in plastic. So just find an envelope you've got lying around and be sure to label it. Separating the trebizond into all of these little components is time consuming, but definitely worth the effort. Happy stitching!